The air crackled with the energy of 1,000 summer revelers, string lights crisscrossed overhead, casting a warm, hazy glow on the bustling crowds that thronged the food stalls and music stages of the annual Summerfest. The aroma of grilled sausages, fried dough, and something vaguely floral hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sounds of laughter, chatter, and the distant thrum of a cover band butchering a classic rock anthem. This was Mark's kind of scene. Mark, propelled by a cocktail of cheap beer and youthful exuberance, navigated the throngs with a practiced ease. He wasn't exactly drunk, more buoyed, just enough to make him feel invincible, to amplify his already considerable appetite for mischief. He'd always been a bit of a prankster, a class clown who never quite grew out of his need for attention, even if that attention sometimes came with a side of detention. His friends, Ben and Sarah, flanked him, their own levels of intoxication mirroring his own. Ben, lanky and perpetually grinning, occasionally bumped into passers-by with a mumbled apology. Sarah, usually the voice of reason, was currently belting out the lyrics to the aforementioned butchered rock anthem, blissfully off-key. Mark, Ben, and Sarah formed an unlikely trio, bound together by years of shared experiences, bad decisions, and an undeniable, if occasionally strained, affection. Ben was the loyal follower, always up for anything as long as it involved a laugh. Sarah, despite her occasional exasperation with their antics, provided a necessary anchor, a grounding force that prevented them from completely spiraling into chaos. The security presence at the festival was visible, but discreet. Guards in dark blue uniforms patrolled the perimeter and mingled amongst the crowd, their expressions impassive, their eyes constantly scanning for trouble. They were more of a reassuring presence than an intimidating one, a silent promise of order amidst the controlled mayhem. Mark, however, saw them as something else entirely. An untapped source of amusement. His gaze landed on one guard in particular, a towering figure standing near the entrance to the beer garden. The guard was easily 6'4", built like a linebacker, and possessed the kind of stoic expression that suggested he'd seen it all and wasn't particularly impressed. He stood ramrod straight, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes unwavering. Perched atop his head was a perfectly crisp, impeccably clean security guard hat. At a mischievous glint sparked in Mark's eyes. "Wouldn't it be hilarious?" he muttered, nudging Ben with his elbow. Ben, ever the eager accomplice, followed Mark's gaze. "Wouldn't it be hilarious what?" he slurred, his words slightly garbled. Mark lowered his voice, conspiratorially. "Wouldn't it be hilarious if I snatched that guard's hat?" Sarah, momentarily pausing her off-key rendition, overheard the tail end of the conversation. "Mark, don't even think about it," she warned, her tone sharper than usual. "You're going to get yourself into trouble." But Mark, fueled by alcohol and an insatiable desire to prove his daring, was already formulating a plan. Sarah's warning only served to solidify his resolve that it was just a harmless prank. He reasoned, a bit of harmless fun. The guard would probably just laugh it off. Besides, how hard could it be? Mark's brain, already swimming in a sea of beer and bravado, latched onto the hat-snatching idea with the tenacity of a drowning man grabbing a life raft. It wasn't just a whim anymore. It was a mission, challenge, a chance to etch his name into the annals of Summerfest legend, or at least, into the hazy memories of Ben and Sarah. He replayed the scenario in his head, each iteration becoming more elaborate, more daring, more hilarious. He pictured the guard's bewildered expression, the ripple of laughter through the crowd. The sheer audacity of it all. It was a masterpiece of comedic genius, or so he convinced himself. The chosen guard, as Mark observed him more closely, was less a man and more a monument. His uniform was immaculate, his boots gleaming, his posture unwavering. He radiated an aura of quiet authority, a silent declaration that he was not to be trifled with. His height alone was intimidating. Mark estimated he was a good head taller than him, and at least twice as wide. His face, etched with lines that spoke of long hours and countless encounters with drunken festival-goers, was a mask of impassivity. He was the antithesis of everything Mark represented. Order versus chaos, discipline versus impulsiveness, sobriety versus, well, whatever state Mark was currently in. This, of course, only added to the allure of the challenge. Snatching the hat from some scrawny, nervous security intern wouldn't be nearly as satisfying. This was a worthy adversary, a formidable obstacle to be overcome. The greater the risk, the greater the reward, or so Mark's addled brain reasoned. Ben, sensing Mark's growing determination, chimed in with his usual brand of enthusiastic encouragement. "Dude, you totally gotta do it," he exclaimed, nearly knocking over a nearby trash can. "Imagine his face. It'll be epic." Sarah, however, remained unconvinced. "Mark, seriously, this is a terrible idea," she reiterated, her voice laced with exasperation. "You're gonna get arrested, or worse. That guy looks like he could bench press a car." Mark waved off her concerns with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Relax, Sarah. It's just a prank," he said, his voice dripping with false confidence. "I'll be in and out before he even knows what hit him. Besides," he added with a sly grin, "what's life without a little bit of adventure?" He began to formulate a plan, a complex and intricate scheme involving misdirection, distraction, and a healthy dose of sheer dumb luck. He would feign tripping, stumble towards the guard, and as he reached out to steady himself, he would deftly snatch the hat and make a clean getaway that was foolproof. At least in his mind, he ignored the nagging voice in the back of his head, the one that sounded suspiciously like Sarah, warning him of the potential consequences. He dismissed the rising tide of anxiety in his stomach, attributing it to the excitement of the moment. He focused solely on the image of himself, triumphant, holding the guard's hat aloft, basking in the adulation of the crowd. This was going to be legendary. The moment of truth arrived. Mark, heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, took a deep breath and launched his foolproof plan into action. He staggered forward, feigning a stumble with an Oscar-worthy performance. At least he thought so. He extended his arm, aiming for the guard's shoulder, his fingers twitching with anticipation. Except, reality rarely adheres to meticulously crafted plans, especially when those plans are conceived by a slightly drunk prankster with a penchant for the dramatic. Instead of a graceful stumble, Mark's legs tangled, and he lurched forward with the grace of a newborn giraffe. His outstretched hand missed the guard's shoulder entirely, instead flailing wildly in the air like a drunken octopus. The element of surprise, which was crucial to his plan, was completely lost. The guard, far from being bewildered or amused, reacted with lightning speed and brutal efficiency. Years of training and countless encounters with unruly patrons had honed his instincts to a razor-sharp edge. He didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't even blink. He simply acted. Before Mark could even register what was happening, a fist, seemingly the size of a small ham, connected squarely with his face. The force of the blow sent a shockwave through his entire body, a blinding flash of pain that eclipsed all thought. He tasted blood, felt his teeth rattle, and saw stars exploding behind his eyelids. The world tilted, spun, and then abruptly went dark. His carefully constructed plan dissolved into a chaotic jumble of pain, confusion, and regret. The triumphant image of himself basking in the adulation of the crowd was replaced by the harsh reality of a very large, very angry security guard. The punch was just the beginning. Before Mark could even crumple to the ground, the guard had him in a vice-like grip. He was hoisted into the air, spun around, and slammed onto the unforgiving asphalt with a force that knocked the wind out of him. The breath rushed from his lungs in a strangled gasp, leaving him gasping for air. The crowd, initially oblivious to the unfolding drama, suddenly became aware of the commotion. Murmurs rippled through the throng, heads turned, and a circle of onlookers began to form. The festive atmosphere abruptly evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of unease. Ben and Sarah, who had been watching from the sidelines with a mixture of amusement and dread, were now frozen in stunned silence. They watched in horror as their friend, the self-proclaimed master of pranks, was unceremoniously subdued by the towering security guard. Mark, lying on the ground, dazed and disoriented, could only manage a pathetic groan. His face throbbed, his head swam, and his ego lay shattered into a million pieces. The harmless prank had gone horribly, spectacularly wrong. The guard, his expression still impassive, pinned Mark to the ground with one knee pressed firmly against his back. He reached for his handcuffs, the metallic click echoing in the sudden silence. Mark, realizing the gravity of his situation, began to panic. This wasn't the way the story was supposed to end. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around Mark's wrists, the click echoing in the sudden hush that had fallen over the crowd. The sound seemed to amplify his humiliation. A public declaration of his failure, he lay sprawled on the asphalt, his face throbbing, his vision swimming, his ego utterly crushed. The festive atmosphere that had enveloped him just moments before had vanished, replaced by a suffocating sense of shame and regret. He tried to focus, to regain some semblance of composure, but his brain felt like a scrambled egg. He could hear the murmur of the crowd, a low, indistinct hum that seemed to judge and condemn him in equal measure. He imagined their faces, their expressions of shock, amusement, and disapproval. He was a spectacle, a cautionary tale unfolding before their very eyes. Ben and Sarah, who had been his enthusiastic accomplices just moments before, were now paralyzed by shock. The laughter that had bubbled beneath the surface of their earlier conversations had been abruptly extinguished, replaced by a stunned silence. Ben's usual goofy grin had vanished, replaced by a look of wide-eyed horror. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disappointment. They stood frozen, unsure of what to do, caught between their loyalty to their friend and the overwhelming gravity of the situation. The guard, his face still an impassive mask, stood over Mark, his presence radiating authority and control. He spoke in a low, measured tone, his words laced with a hint of disdain. "You're under arrest for assault and disorderly conduct," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "You have the right to remain silent." Mark barely registered the words. His mind was racing, trying to process the events that had just transpired. How had it all gone so wrong? It was supposed to be a harmless prank, a bit of harmless fun. Now he was lying on the ground, handcuffed, facing arrest, his reputation in tatters. He tried to speak, to offer some explanation, some excuse, but his mouth was dry, his throat constricted. All that emerged was a pathetic groan. He looked up at Ben and Sarah, pleadingly, hoping for some sign of support, some indication that they were still on his side. But their faces remained frozen, their expressions unreadable. They were as stunned and bewildered as he was. The bond that had held them together for so long seemed to have frayed, stretched to its breaking point by the sudden and unexpected turn of events as the guard tightened the handcuffs. Mark felt a surge of panic. He was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of the system. The world seemed to close in around him, the sounds of the festival fading into a distant hum. He was alone, facing the consequences of his actions, with no one to blame but himself. The harmless prank had become a nightmare, and it was only just beginning. The flashing blue and red lights cut through the festive atmosphere like a knife, announcing the arrival of the police. The crowd, already buzzing with nervous energy, parted to make way for the patrol car as it cautiously maneuvered through the throng. Officer Miller, a stocky woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and years of experience dealing with drunken shenanigans, emerged from the vehicle. She surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, taking in the handcuffed Mark sprawled on the ground, the towering security guard standing impassively beside him, and the gawking crowd that had gathered to witness the spectacle. Her expression remained neutral, betraying no hint of surprise or judgment. She'd seen it all before, probably multiple times that week. Officer Miller approached Mark, her footsteps firm and deliberate. She knelt beside him, her eyes scrutinizing his face. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice sharp and authoritative. The security guard stepped forward, offering a concise explanation of the events that had transpired. He recounted Mark's attempted hat-snatching, the resulting altercation, and the charges he was recommending: assault and disturbing the peace. Mark, still dazed and disoriented, seized the opportunity to offer his own version of events. "It was just a joke, officer," he stammered, his voice pleading. "I didn't mean any harm. It was just a prank." Officer Miller's expression remained unchanged. She had heard every excuse in the book, and she wasn't buying this one. "A joke that resulted in you assaulting a security guard?" she retorted, her voice laced with skepticism. "That's not much of a joke, son." She turned her attention back to the security guard. "Are you pressing charges?" she asked. The guard nodded. "Yes, officer. I am." Officer Miller sighed. It was clear that this wasn't going to be a simple case of a drunken misunderstanding. She turned back to Mark, her gaze unwavering. "Mark, you're officially under arrest." she stated, her voice firm and resolute. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As she recited the Miranda rights, the full gravity of the situation began to dawn on Mark. This wasn't just a minor mishap, a slap on the wrist. This was serious. He was facing criminal charges, a possible jail sentence, a permanent mark on his record. He looked at Ben and Sarah, desperately seeking some sign of support, but their faces remained frozen, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and apprehension. They were powerless to help him, mere spectators in the unfolding drama. Officer Miller helped Mark to his feet, her grip firm but not unkind. He stumbled slightly, his legs still shaky from the impact of the punch. She led him towards the patrol car, the crowd parting to make way for them as he was being escorted away. Mark couldn't help but glance back at the festival. The music still pulsed, the lights still twinkled, the laughter still echoed in the air, but for him, the party was over. The harmless prank had transformed into a life-altering mistake, a stark reminder that actions have consequences, and the consequences were about to become very real. The ride downtown was a blur of flashing lights and muffled sirens. Mark sat in the back of the patrol car, the hard plastic seat digging into his back, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. Officer Miller drove in silence, her focus solely on the road ahead. The radio crackled intermittently, spitting out snippets of police chatter that seemed to underscore the gravity of his situation. As the patrol car sped through the city streets, the initial shock and humiliation began to give way to a chilling sense of reality. The alcohol that had fueled his reckless behavior was rapidly wearing off, leaving him with a pounding headache and a growing sense of dread. He replayed the events of the evening in his mind, each moment re-examined with a newfound clarity. He saw himself, fueled by bravado and the encouragement of his friends, fixating on the idea of snatching the guard's hat. He remembered the thrill of the challenge, the anticipation of the prank, the imagined adulation of the crowd. But now, those memories were tainted by the harsh reality of his actions. He saw the guard's stoic face, the swiftness of his reaction, the force of the punch that had sent him crashing to the ground. He heard the murmur of the crowd, the click of the handcuffs, the cold pronouncement of his arrest. He began to understand the potential consequences of his actions. Assault and disturbing the peace were not minor offenses. They could result in jail time, fines, a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. He imagined the disappointment of his family, the disapproval of his friends, the potential impact on his career. He thought about Sarah's warnings, her pleas for him to reconsider his plan. He had dismissed her concerns, blinded by his own arrogance and the desire to impress his friends. Now, he realized that she had been right all along. He had let his impulsiveness get the better of him, and he was paying the price. The silence in the patrol car was deafening, broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio. Mark tried to speak, to offer some explanation to Officer Miller, but the words caught in his throat. He knew that nothing he could say would change the situation. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. As the patrol car approached the police station, Mark felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The building loomed ahead, a stark and imposing structure that represented everything he feared. He was about to enter a world of bureaucracy, interrogation, and uncertainty. His life, which had seemed so carefree just hours before, was about to be irrevocably changed. The ride downtown had been a sobering one, a stark and painful lesson in the consequences of his actions, and the worst was yet to come. The police station was a stark and sterile environment, a world away from the vibrant energy of the Summerfest. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the linoleum floors and the drab, utilitarian furniture. The air was thick with the smells of disinfectant, stale coffee, and a palpable sense of despair. Officer Miller led Mark through a maze of corridors, each one seemingly more depressing than the last. They passed holding cells filled with a motley assortment of individuals, their faces etched with varying degrees of regret, anger, and resignation. The sounds of shouting, weeping, and the occasional outburst of obscenities echoed through the hallways, creating a cacophony of human misery. Finally, they arrived at the booking desk, a high counter separating the officers from the detainees. A stern-faced officer with a name tag that read Sergeant Davis sat behind the desk, his eyes scanning the room with a weary indifference. "Name," Sergeant Davis barked, his voice devoid of any warmth or empathy. Mark Johnson? Mark stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Sergeant Davis began typing on the computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He asked a series of routine questions. Address, date of birth, occupation, each one chipping away at Mark's sense of identity. Next came the inventory of his personal belongings. His wallet, keys, phone, and even his belt were confiscated and placed in a plastic bag. The removal of each item felt like a further stripping away of his dignity, a symbolic surrender of his freedom. Then came the fingerprinting. Mark was led to a separate station where another officer, his face obscured by a surgical mask, meticulously rolled each of his fingers across an ink pad and pressed them onto a card. The process felt impersonal and invasive, as if he were being reduced to a set of data points, a mere statistic in the criminal justice system. The mugshots were the final indignity. Mark was positioned in front of a backdrop, a bright light shining in his face, his expression a mixture of shame, fear, and resentment. He was instructed to hold a placard with his name and booking number, a permanent record of his transgression. The camera flashed, capturing his image for posterity, a stark reminder of his moment of disgrace as he was being led away from the booking desk. Mark felt a profound sense of dehumanization. He was no longer Mark Johnson, the prankster, the friend, the son. He was just another inmate, a number in a system that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. The experience was jarring, unsettling, and profoundly humiliating. He had gone from being a carefree festival-goer to a processed and catalogued criminal in a matter of hours. The gravity of his situation had sunk in, and he realized that the harmless prank had not only landed him in jail, but it had also stripped him of his identity, his dignity, and his sense of self-worth. The bureaucratic process was a harsh and unforgiving introduction to the world of law and order, a world where jokes were not tolerated, and consequences were very real. The holding cell was a cramped, concrete box, barely larger than a walk-in closet. A single, barred window high up on the wall offered a sliver of a view of the night sky. The only furniture consisted of a metal bench bolted to the floor and a grimy toilet in the corner. The air was thick with the smells of sweat, stale cigarettes, and unwashed bodies. Mark was ushered into the cell by a burly officer, the metal door clanging shut behind him with a resounding thud that echoed through the room. He was now confined with 3 other detainees, each a testament to the various ways in which life can go wrong. In the corner sat a gaunt, middle-aged man with bloodshot eyes and a tremor in his hands. He was clutching a crumpled paper bag and muttering incoherently to himself. This was Earl, picked up for public intoxication after a long day of battling his demons. That he'd lost his job, his family, and his hope to the bottle years ago, and now he drifted through life like a ghost, a cautionary tale etched on his weathered face. Across from Earl sat a young woman with fiery red hair and multiple piercings. She was pacing back and forth, her energy barely contained within the confines of the cell. This was Raven, arrested for protesting outside a corporate building. She was a self-proclaimed activist, a passionate defender of the environment, and she viewed her arrest as a badge of honor, a testament to her commitment to her cause. The third occupant was a large, muscular man with tattoos covering his arms and neck. He was sitting on the bench, his eyes closed, his face a mask of stoic indifference. This was Big Tony, arrested for getting into a bar fight. He was a man of few words, but his presence filled the cell with a palpable sense of menace. He'd spent time inside before, and the holding cell was clearly not a new experience for him. Mark, still reeling from the events of the evening, felt completely out of place. In this motley crew, he was a prankster, not a criminal. He'd never been in trouble with the law before, and he felt like he'd stumbled into a world that was completely alien to him. He stood awkwardly near the door, unsure of what to do or say. He avoided eye contact with the other detainees, feeling a mixture of fear, embarrassment, and pity. Earl continued to mutter to himself, oblivious to Mark's presence. Raven paced back and forth, occasionally shooting Mark a disdainful glance. Big Tony remained motionless, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and steady. The silence in the cell was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the occasional cough or sigh. Mark felt like he was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't escape. He had tried to snatch a hat for laughs, and now he was sharing a holding cell with a collection of society's outcasts. The harmless prank had led him to a place he never imagined he would be. A place where laughter was a distant memory, and the only sound was the echo of despair. The long night had just begun. The opportunity for a phone call felt like a lifeline, a chance to connect with the outside world and break through the suffocating isolation of the holding cell. After what seemed like an eternity, an officer beckoned Mark over to a payphone mounted on the wall just outside the cell. The phone was grimy and smelled faintly of stale cigarettes, but to Mark, it was a symbol of hope. He knew who he needed to call. His sister, Emily. She was the most level-headed and reliable person he knew, the one who always managed to keep him grounded, even when he was teetering on the edge of disaster. He knew she wouldn't be happy, but he also knew she wouldn't abandon him. He fumbled with the phone, his hands trembling as he dialed Emily's number. Each ring felt like an eternity, amplifying his anxiety and guilt. Finally, she answered, her voice groggy and tinged with sleep. "Mark? What time is it? Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "Emily, it's me. I'm in jail." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Jail? Mark, what happened? What did you do?" He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. It's a long story that I was at the Summerfest and I tried to pull a prank, and it didn't go well." He recounted the events of the evening, his voice growing softer with each detail. He told her about the hat-snatching attempt, the punch, the arrest, the booking process, and the dehumanizing experience of being processed as a criminal. As he spoke, he could feel Emily's disappointment radiating through the phone line. He knew she had always held him to a higher standard, and he had let her down again. When he finished his story, there was another long silence. He could hear Emily sighing heavily. On the other end of the line, "Mark," she said, her voice strained. "I don't even know what to say. I'm so disappointed in you. What were you thinking? You know better than to do something so stupid." He swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "I know, Emily, that I know that I wasn't thinking, that I was just being an idiot. This isn't just some silly prank, Mark," she continued, her voice rising in anger. "This is serious. You're facing criminal charges. You could go to jail. What about your job? What about your future?" He didn't have an answer. He had jeopardized everything with his reckless behavior, and he had no one to blame but himself. "I'm so worried about you, Mark," Emily said, her voice softening slightly. "I don't know what to do anymore. I've tried to help you, to guide you, but you just keep making the same mistakes." He could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the weariness of someone who had carried the burden of his mistakes for far too long. "I know, Emily," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll see what I can do," she said, her voice resigned. "I'll try to find a lawyer. But Mark, you need to understand that this is on you. You need to take responsibility for your actions. I can't keep bailing you out of trouble forever." The conversation ended with a heavy silence, a sense of unresolved tension hanging in the air. Mark hung up the phone, feeling even more isolated and alone than before. The lifeline had become a reminder of his own failures, a stark illustration of the disappointment and concern he had caused his sister. The harmless prank had not only landed him in jail, but it had also strained his most important relationship, leaving him with a profound sense of guilt and regret. The interrogation room was small and claustrophobic, painted a drab shade of gray. That a metal table and 2 chairs were the only furnishings. The air was thick with the silence that precedes a storm, a tense stillness that amplified Mark's anxiety. Detective Harding, a man in his late 40s with a weary face and a sharp gaze, entered the room. He carried a file folder under his arm and a cup of coffee in his hand. He sat down across from Mark, his demeanor initially neutral, almost friendly. "Mark Johnson, right?" he said, his voice calm and conversational. "I'm Detective Harding. I just want to ask you a few questions about what happened at the Summerfest tonight." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes studying Mark intently. "So, you want to tell me your side of the story?" Mark hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. He knew he had the right to remain silent, but he also knew that cooperating might be his best chance to mitigate the damage. He decided to tread carefully, to try to explain his actions without incriminating himself further. He recounted the events of the evening, emphasizing the fact that he had been drinking and that he had intended no harm. He described the hat-snatching attempt as a harmless prank. A spur-of-the-moment decision fueled by alcohol and youthful exuberance. Detective Harding listened patiently, his expression remaining impassive. That he didn't interrupt, didn't offer any judgment, just allowed Mark to talk. But as Mark continued his story, the detective's demeanor began to shift. His questions became more pointed, his tone more skeptical. "So, you're telling me you just thought it would be funny to steal a security guard's hat?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Well, yeah," Mark stammered. "I mean, it was just a joke. That I didn't think it would be a big deal." "And you didn't think that grabbing a security guard's hat might be considered assault?" Detective Harding pressed, his eyes narrowing. Mark squirmed in his seat. "I guess I didn't really think about it," he admitted. "I was just being stupid." "Stupid?" Detective Harding repeated, his voice incredulous. "You assaulted a security guard, caused a disturbance, and now you're telling me it was just stupid?" Mark struggled to explain himself, to convey the remorse he genuinely felt. But the more he talked, the deeper he seemed to dig himself into a hole. He tried to emphasize that he hadn't intended to hurt anyone, that he regretted his actions, that he had learned a valuable lesson. But Detective Harding wasn't buying it. He saw Mark as just another entitled young man who thought he was above the law, who believed that his actions had no consequences. "Mr. Johnson," Detective Harding said, his voice hardening, "I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've heard every excuse in the book. You can try to downplay this as a harmless prank, but the fact is you committed a crime, and now you have to face the consequences." He leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "This is your chance to show some remorse, to take responsibility for your actions. Are you going to do that, or are you going to keep trying to minimize what you did?" Mark knew that he was at a crossroads. He could continue to try to justify his actions, to portray himself as a victim of circumstance, or he could admit his mistake, express genuine remorse, and hope for some leniency. He looked at Detective Harding, his eyes pleading. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice sincere. "I really am. That I know I messed up. I was stupid and reckless. And I regret what I did. I'm willing to accept whatever consequences come my way." Detective Harding studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "All right, Mr. Johnson," he said. "That's a start." Sleep was an elusive luxury that long night. The hard metal bench offered little comfort, and the cacophony of sounds from the holding cell, Earl's incessant muttering, Raven's restless pacing, Big Tony's occasional snores, made it impossible to find any peace. But even if the physical conditions had been more conducive, Mark doubted he would have been able to sleep. His mind was racing, replaying the events of the evening, analyzing his mistakes, and grappling with the uncertain future that lay ahead. That he stared up at the ceiling, the flickering fluorescent light casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The holding cell felt like a tomb, a place of confinement and despair. He was trapped, not just physically, but also mentally, weighed down by the weight of his own actions. He thought about his past behavior, his penchant for pranks, his need for attention, his tendency to act without thinking. He had always justified his actions as harmless fun, a way to liven things up, to break the monotony of everyday life. But now, he realized that his harmless fun had consequences, that his actions affected other people, that his impulsiveness had a price. He thought about his family, his friends, his job. He imagined their reactions when they found out about his arrest. He pictured the disappointment on his parents' faces, the disapproval in his friends' eyes, the potential repercussions for his career. He had worked hard to build a good life for himself, and now he had jeopardized everything with one stupid act. He thought about Emily, her disappointment, her worry, her unwavering support. He knew that he had hurt her deeply, that he had tested her patience, that he had strained their relationship to the breaking point. He vowed to make amends, to earn back her trust, to prove to her that he was capable of change. He thought about the security guard, the man whose hat he had tried to steal. He imagined the guard's anger, his frustration, his sense of violation. He realized that his harmless prank had been an act of disrespect, an assault on the guard's dignity and authority. He felt a pang of remorse, a genuine desire to apologize for his actions. He thought about Detective Harding, his weariness, his skepticism. His plea for remorse. He knew that he had a long way to go to earn the detective's respect. To convince him that he was truly sorry for what he had done, he resolved to cooperate fully, to accept whatever consequences came his way, to demonstrate that he was willing to learn from his mistakes. As the hours ticked by, the weight of his situation grew heavier. The reality of his predicament sank in, and he began to understand the profound impact that this incident would have on his future. He was facing criminal charges, a possible jail sentence, a permanent mark on his record. His life was about to change, and he had no idea what the future held. The long night was a crucible, a trial by fire that forced him to confront his demons, to acknowledge his flaws, and to commit to a better path. He was no longer the carefree prankster, the impulsive attention seeker. He was a changed man, humbled by his experience, determined to learn from his mistakes, and ready to face whatever consequences lay ahead. The harmless prank had transformed him, forcing him to grow up, to take responsibility for his actions, and to embrace a new, more mature version of himself. The arraignment was a blur of legal jargon and bureaucratic procedure. After a fitful and sleepless night, Mark was led into the courtroom, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face pale and drawn. The courtroom was a somber space, filled with the hushed whispers of lawyers, the shuffling of papers, and the air of solemnity that befits a place where justice is dispensed. He stood before the judge, a stern-looking woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, her gaze unwavering. The charges were read aloud. Assault and disturbing the peace. The prosecutor, a young and ambitious lawyer, argued for a high bail, citing the seriousness of the offense and the potential for Mark to flee. Mark's court-appointed lawyer, a public defender named Ms. Rodriguez, argued for a lower bail, emphasizing Mark's lack of prior criminal record, his remorse for his actions, and his commitment to appearing in court. She explained that Mark was a working member of the community with strong ties to his family and that he posed no threat to public safety. The judge listened attentively to both arguments, her expression unreadable. Then, she spoke, her voice clear and authoritative. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "the charges before this court are serious. Assaulting a security guard is not a joke, and it will not be tolerated. However, given your lack of prior criminal record and the mitigating circumstances presented by your counsel, I am willing to set bail." She set bail at $5,000, a sum that felt both manageable and insurmountable. Mark knew that his family would struggle to come up with that amount of money, but he also knew that remaining in jail would jeopardize his job and his future. The judge then turned her attention back to Mark. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice stern, "I am releasing you on bail with the understanding that you will appear at all future court dates. I am also ordering you to stay away from the Summerfest and to have no contact with the security guard you assaulted. Do you understand?" Mark nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor." "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I want you to understand the seriousness of the situation you are in. If you are convicted of these charges, you could face jail time, fines, and a criminal record that will follow you for the rest of your life. This is not something to be taken lightly." She paused, her eyes fixed on Mark's face. "Mr. Johnson, do you wish to enter a plea at this time?" Ms. Rodriguez leaned over and whispered in Mark's ear. "We can plead not guilty and fight the charges, or we can plead guilty and try to negotiate a plea bargain. What do you want to do?" Mark hesitated. He knew that pleading not guilty would prolong the legal process and increase the risk of a harsher sentence if he was convicted. But he also knew that pleading guilty would mean admitting his guilt and accepting the consequences. He thought about his conversation with Detective Harding, his commitment to taking responsibility for his actions. He thought about Emily, her disappointment, her worry, her unwavering support. He knew that he needed to do the right thing, even if it was difficult. He took a deep breath and looked at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and resolute, "I plead guilty." The judge nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "I appreciate your honesty and your willingness to take responsibility for your actions. I will take that into consideration when I sentence you." Emily managed to scrape together the $5,000 for Mark's bail, a financial burden that would take months to overcome. Stepping out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight felt surreal. as if he were emerging from a long, dark tunnel back into the real world. But the real world was no longer the carefree playground he had once known. It was a world where his actions had consequences, where his mistakes had a price. The legal process was just beginning. He faced legal fees that would drain his savings, countless hours of community service that would disrupt his life, and the looming threat of a criminal record that would haunt his future. Ms. Rodriguez, his public defender, explained that she would try to negotiate a plea bargain with the prosecutor, hoping to minimize the sentence. But there were no guarantees. The consequences extended beyond the legal realm. His relationship with Emily was strained, her disappointment palpable. He knew he had tested her loyalty, stretched her patience. To its limits, he would have to work hard to earn back her trust, to prove to her that he was truly capable of change. His friends reacted in different ways. Ben, ever the loyal companion, offered his support, but there was an awkwardness between them, a sense that their carefree days of pranks and mischief were over. Sarah, on the other hand, was more distant, her disappointment evident. She had warned him, pleaded with him to reconsider, and he had ignored her. He knew that he had damaged their friendship, and he wasn't sure if it could be repaired. His job was also in jeopardy. His employer, a conservative accounting firm, was not pleased with the news of his arrest. He was suspended pending the outcome of the legal proceedings, and he knew that he could lose his job if he was convicted. As the days turned into weeks, Mark grappled with the reality of his situation. He spent his days performing community service, cleaning up trash in the local park, a task that felt both humbling and therapeutic. He attended Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, even though he wasn't an alcoholic, hoping to gain some insight into his impulsive behavior and to learn how to control his urges. He met with Ms. Rodriguez regularly, preparing for his sentencing hearing, reviewing the evidence, and discussing his options. He also reached out to the security guard, writing him a heartfelt letter of apology, expressing his remorse for his actions, and offering to make amends in any way he could. He didn't receive a response, but he found some solace in knowing that he had tried to do the right thing. The reflection was painful, but necessary. He was forced to confront his flaws, to acknowledge his mistakes, and to take responsibility for his actions. He realized that his life had been built on a foundation of impulsiveness and recklessness, and that it was time to build a new foundation based on responsibility, maturity, and respect. The harmless prank had transformed his life, forcing him to grow up, to face the consequences of his actions, and to embrace a new, more meaningful existence. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was determined to make amends, to rebuild his life, and to prove to himself and to everyone else that he was capable of change. He was no longer the man who had tried to snatch a hat for laughs. He was a man who had learned a valuable lesson, a man who was ready to face the future, whatever it may hold. Months later, Mark stood before the judge for his sentencing hearing. Ms. Rodriguez had negotiated a plea bargain with the prosecutor, a deal that would allow Mark to avoid jail time in exchange for a guilty plea, a substantial fine, and a lengthy term of community service. The judge, after considering the circumstances of the case, Mark's remorseful statement, and his efforts to make amends, accepted the plea bargain. As Mark left the courtroom, a free man but still burdened by the consequences of his actions. He knew that his life had changed forever. The harmless prank had taught him a valuable lesson about impulse control, respecting authority, and the far-reaching consequences of his actions. He had learned that actions have repercussions, that choices matter, and that even the smallest decisions can have a profound impact on his life and the lives of others. He dedicated himself to rebuilding his life, one step at a time. He completed his community service, working diligently and without complaint. He paid his fine, sacrificing luxuries and tightening his budget. He continued to attend AA meetings, gaining a better understanding of his impulsive behavior and learning coping mechanisms to manage his urges. He worked tirelessly to mend his strained relationships. He apologized to Emily for his reckless behavior and for the burden he had placed on her. He spent time with her, listening to her concerns, offering his support, and demonstrating his commitment to change. Slowly, their relationship began to heal, their bond strengthened by the shared experience. He also reached out to Sarah, acknowledging his mistake and expressing his regret for damaging their friendship. It took time, but eventually, she forgave him. Their friendship was never quite the same, but it was rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and respect. His employer, impressed by his remorse and his commitment to rehabilitation, offered him his job back. He returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to prove that he was worthy of their trust. Years later, Mark would often reflect on that fateful night at the Summerfest. He would cringe at the memory of his reckless behavior, his arrogance, his lack of judgment. But he would also recognize that the harmless prank had been a turning point in his life, a catalyst for growth and change. He became an advocate for responsible decision-making, sharing his story with young people, warning them about the dangers of impulsiveness and the importance of respecting authority. He volunteered at a local community center, mentoring at-risk youth, helping them to make better choices and to avoid the mistakes he had made. He never fully escaped the shadow of his past, but he learned to live with it, to use it as a reminder of the valuable lessons he had learned. He became a better man, a more responsible citizen, a more compassionate human being. And so, the story of the man who tried to snatch a guard's hat for laughs concludes, not with a punchline, but with a hard-earned lesson, a lesson about the transformative power of consequences, the importance of taking responsibility, and the enduring capacity for growth and change, even in the face of adversity. Mark's journey wasn't just about avoiding jail. It was about finding himself and becoming a better version of that self through the fire of a very public and painful mistake.